I didn't just switch from Windows to Linux like a normal upgrade. I went much further than that. I removed every Windows app I used and replaced each one with a Linux version or a Linux alternative. I didn't allow shortcuts. I didn't use Wine. I didn't keep just one Windows program on the side. If something didn't exist on Linux, I had to change how I worked or find a different tool completely. No exceptions. This video shows what that actually looks like in real life day by day. For this experiment, I'm using Linux Mint 22. It's fully updated, running the Cinnamon desktop. Everything I'm showing here is not theory. This is the system I use for real daily work. Let's start with something simple but important. Web browsing. On Windows, most people use Chrome or Edge. On Linux, it's basically the same story. Nothing really changes here in a noticeable way. You still have Chrome. You still have Firefox. You still have Brave. You sign in and everything comes with you. Bookmarks sync, passwords sync, extensions sync. Within a few minutes, it feels exactly like your old setup. And honestly, this is the easiest part of the whole switch. There's no learning curve here. No adjustment period. Just install your browser and move on. What this really shows is something important. Linux doesn't change the internet. You're still using the same websites, the same tools, the same online services. The operating system is just getting out of your way. Once browsing is done, the next basic thing is file management. On Windows, people are used to File Explorer. It's been part of everyday life for decades. So this is usually where people expect problems. But on Linux Mint, the file manager feels almost identical in practice. You can drag and drop files. You can search for anything quickly. USB drives appear automatically when you plug them in. Network drives connect without complicated steps. There's nothing strange or confusing here. Most of the time, it just works. And that's the pattern you start noticing early on. The basic daily tasks don't feel new. They feel familiar enough that your habits carry over without effort. Now we move into one of the biggest concerns people usually have when switching systems, Office work. This is where most users feel nervous because Windows is closely tied to Microsoft Office. Word, Excel, and PowerPoint are what a lot of people depend on every day. On Linux, I replaced all of that with LibreOffice. Writer replaces Word. Calc replaces Excel. Impress replaces PowerPoint. At first, it sounds like a downgrade. But for normal day-to-day work, it actually holds up better than most people expect. Things like writing documents, making letters, handling invoices, taking notes, and building basic spreadsheets all work without trouble. Presentations also work fine for simple and medium-level use. File compatibility with Microsoft Office formats is good enough that you don't constantly think about it. You open files, edit them, and send them back without much friction. Of course, there are limits. If you're dealing with very advanced Excel files, complex formulas, or heavy macros, you might run into issues. Some highly formatted Word documents can also behave differently. But for regular users, these problems are not common in daily work. So in most cases, LibreOffice does not stop your workflow. It just replaces it. Another area that actually surprised me was PDFs. On Windows, people often rely on extra software or paid tools to view and edit PDFs properly. On Linux, PDF handling feels built-in and smoother. You can open PDFs instantly, scroll through them quickly, highlight text, add notes, and even sign documents without needing extra apps. Everything feels lighter and faster, almost like the system is designed for it from the start. Now let's talk about media playback. This is one of the least stressful parts of the entire switch. On Windows, VLC is already the go-to media player for most people. On Linux, that doesn't change at all. VLC works the same way, and in many cases it feels even more stable. There are no codec problems, no missing file errors. You don't have to hunt for extra downloads just to play a video. You open the file and it plays. Audio also works immediately without setup headaches. It's simple, direct, and reliable. At this point, you start noticing a pattern again. A lot of core tasks don't require fixing anything. They just work out of the box. Next comes image editing, and this is where things start to feel more different. Adobe Photoshop doesn't exist natively on Linux, so I replaced it with GIMP. GIMP is powerful, but it doesn't try to copy Photoshop exactly. That's an important shift in thinking. If you expect it to behave exactly the same, you'll feel frustrated. But once you adjust your mindset, it becomes a strong tool for editing photos, making thumbnails, and handling basic design tasks. It may not feel identical, but it gets the job done for most content creation work. So this phase is really where the switch becomes more real. Office tools, PDFs, media, and basic creative work all start moving into Linux alternatives, and for most everyday tasks, they hold up better than expected. Now we get into more creative tools, where things start to feel less like a straight copy of Windows and more like a different way of working. Let's start with vector design. On Windows, a lot of people use Adobe Illustrator for logos, icons, and clean graphic work. On Linux, I replaced it with Inkscape. At first glance, it feels different. The layout is not the same, and the tools are arranged differently. So there is a short learning curve, but once you understand it, Inkscape is more than capable of handling normal design work. You can create logos, build icons, work with SVG files, and design simple graphics without running into major limits. The end results are the same, you just reach them in a different way. Next is video editing, which is one of the most important tools for content creators. I replaced Adobe Premiere Pro with Kdenlive. This was one of the biggest surprises in the whole setup. I expected problems, lag, or missing features. But instead, Kdenlive handled real editing work quite well. You can cut clips, build timelines, add transitions, manage multiple audio tracks, and export finished videos without major issues. It's not Premiere Pro. The ecosystem is smaller and some advanced tools are missing. But for YouTuber videos and normal editing work, it is more than enough. Most importantly, it didn't crash or force me into subscriptions, which is something a lot of people are tired of. Now let's talk about screen recording. This one was actually easy. I used OBS Studio, which already exists on Windows as well, but works just as smoothly on Linux. Recording your screen, capturing gameplay, adding voiceovers, and making tutorials all feel exactly the same. There's no real difference in performance or quality. In some ways it even feels more stable because it's not fighting against background Windows processes. Now moving into utilities and everyday tools. On Windows many people use tools like WinRAR or 7-zip for file compression. On Linux you don't really need them. The system handles compressed files directly. Zip, tar, and even RAR files can be opened from the file manager without installing extra software. No pop-ups, no trial versions, no buy premium messages. It just works in the background. That's a small thing, but it adds up over time. Next is cloud storage, which is where things become a bit more mixed. OneDrive doesn't have a full official Linux app, so you can't always rely on a native sync experience like on Windows. But there are still options. You can use OneDrive through the browser without issues. For many people, that is already enough. Other cloud services like Google Drive also work perfectly in the browser, and third-party tools can fill in syncing gaps if needed. So while it's not as seamless as Windows, it's still fully usable. At this point, most everyday creative and productivity tools are covered. And you start noticing something important. Linux is not missing everything. It just handles things differently. It's less about matching Windows feature for feature, and more about finding tools that get the job done in a stable, direct way. Now we get into one of the most debated parts of switching operating systems, gaming. On Windows, gaming is straightforward. You install a game, it runs, and most tools are designed around that environment. On Linux, the experience has improved a lot, but it still depends heavily on what games you play. For most games, Steam is the main platform. And with Proton, many Windows games now run on Linux without needing extra setup. Some games run surprisingly well. In some cases, even better than expected. Load times can be similar and performance can be close to Windows depending on your hardware and drivers, but it's not perfect. Some games simply do not run, especially those with strict anti-cheat systems. Competitive online games are still the biggest limitation area. If your gaming is focused on those titles, Linux can feel restrictive. So the experience really depends on your library. Single-player games and casual titles are usually fine. Online competitive games are more hit or miss. Next is system maintenance, and this is where Linux feels very different, in a good way. On Windows, users often deal with constant background tasks. Antivirus alerts, driver updated tools, registry cleaners, and random pop-ups are common. On Linux Mint, most of that simply does not exist in the same way. There's no need for third-party antivirus software in most cases. There are no constant warnings or forced cleanup tools. The system stays quiet unless something actually needs attention. Updates are handled through one simple update manager. You click update, it installs everything, and you're done. No interruptions, no complicated steps. Driver management is also much simpler. Most drivers are handled automatically by the system or installed through standard updates. Over time, this creates a different feeling. The system feels more stable and less noisy. Now comes the honest part, the adjustment period. Not everything feels equal when you first switch. Some apps behave differently. Some workflows take longer at the start. And some tools require you to learn new habits instead of relying on muscle memory. This is where most people struggle, not because Linux is difficult, but because it is different. But something interesting happens after a while. You stop thinking in terms of specific apps. Instead of saying, I need Photoshop, you start thinking, I need to edit this image. Instead of, I need Microsoft Word, it becomes, I need to write this document. The focus shifts from software names to actual tasks. And that shift changes how you work. Linux doesn't always give you identical tools, but it gives you enough tools to complete your work without forcing you into one company system or pricing model. Finally, the main takeaway from this entire experiment is simple. For most everyday users, replacing Windows applications with Linux alternatives is completely possible. It takes some adjustment, and it is not always identical, but it is very doable. If your work is based on browsing, writing, content creation, coding, or general productivity, Linux Mint already offers mature and stable tools. But if your workflow depends on a very specific Windows-only application, then Linux will feel limiting in that area. In the end, this experiment doesn't prove that one system is universally better than the other. What it really shows is something more important. Most people are not actually dependent on Windows itself. They are dependent on a few specific applications. And once you remove that dependency, switching becomes much less scary than it first seems. So after going through everything, the conclusion becomes pretty clear. Switching from Windows to Linux is not just about changing the operating system. It's about changing the way you think about your tools. Most people assume the hard part is the OS itself. But in reality, the real dependency is not Windows, it's the specific apps you've been using for years. Once those apps are replaced, everything feels unfamiliar at first. But that feeling doesn't last forever. After a short adjustment period, something changes. You stop caring about brand names like Word, Photoshop, or Excel. You stop asking, which software do I need? And start asking, what am I trying to do? Write a document, edit an image, cut a video, browse the web, manage files. These are tasks, not software products. And Linux pushes you toward that mindset naturally. It doesn't lock you into one company's ecosystem. It doesn't force subscriptions for basic features. It doesn't constantly push updates that change how things work overnight. Instead, it gives you a set of tools and lets you decide how to use them. That doesn't mean everything is perfect. There are still gaps. Some professional software doesn't exist on Linux. Some games don't run, and some workflows need adjustments or compromises. But for a large number of users, those gaps are not deal breakers. They are just limits you learn to work around. What surprised me most during this switch wasn't what Linux could do. It was how little I actually missed once I adapted. The fear of losing Windows apps feels bigger before the switch than after it. And that's the main lesson from this whole experience. The operating system matters less than the workflow you build on top of it. If your workflow is flexible, Linux can handle it. If your workflow is tied to very specific tools, then the switch becomes harder, but still not impossible in many cases. So the real takeaway is simple. This isn't about Linux being better than Windows. It's about realizing how much of your setup is based on habit, not necessity. And once you understand that, switching stops feeling like a huge risk and starts feeling like just another option.